Welcome to this roundtable on urban research in Asia. My name's 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧. I lead the Asian Urbanisms cluster at the Asia Research Institute, or ARI, that has organized this event. I'm also currently director of ARI. ARI was established as a humanities and social science research institute at the National University of Singapore in 2001. And one of the ways in which we're marking the 20th anniversary this year is by holding a series of virtual roundtables. How that's working is that each of ARI's research clusters and programs is assembling a lineup of scholars to reflect on past, present, and especially future directions in the multidisciplinary fields of research that they cover. So far, we've had roundtable events organized by the Identities Cluster, the Asian Migration Cluster, and two separate roundtable events organized by ARI's Inter-Asia Engagements Cluster. Most recently, just last week, a roundtable on Oceanic Asia that was put together by my colleague 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧. That particular event revolved around the issue of what it might mean to make Asian studies less terra-centric or land-focused. And I mentioned that event because, well, not only was it the most recent, it was a great success, very well attended, but also because some strands of thinking associated with an Oceanic Asia intertwine in important ways with emergent senses of what an urban Asia or an urbanizing Asia might mean. Having read influential work on planetary urbanization, like many of you no doubt, over the past decade, I was poised at the beginning of the question and answer session in the Oceanic Asia event last week with a question of my own about oceanic urbanization. If recent work under the umbrella of planetary urbanization has in part been about urbanization as a process that extends way beyond city or suburb to encompass far removed sites of extraction and capitalist operations, then we, as urbanists, need to be thinking not just about operational landscapes, but also about operational seascapes. As it happened, I didn't get the chance to ask my urbanizing oceans question last week for the very good reason that other Oceanic Asia participants raised many other lines of discussion. I'm not sure whether that issue will arise today either, it might do. But the point is that it's one of many ways in which urbanists now, in ARI's 20th anniversary year, are compelled to think differently about the objects, units, and scope of our analysis as compared to when the Asian Urbanisms Cluster was first established at ARI back in 2009. This event today is intended in part to consider some of those wider changes, to trace back what's been covered in the cluster to date, to trace where we're up to, but also to think about a sense of what we might prioritize next in ARI's third decade. So that's broadly how I see things panning out, covering, as the title suggests, critical reflections and new directions. But a few further points of specification are needed as regards what I see this as implying in the case of Asian urbanisms. First, I would certainly not wish to imply that advances in urban studies or any other field are on linear trajectories. There's potentially much to be gained from looking back at long-standing classics in the field, of course, but also at past contributions that may have been relatively overlooked at the time of their original completion or publication. And returning through that to planetary urbanization, of course, that body of work was spurred by many recent developments, economic, technological, and methodological, but undoubtedly one important component of its conceptual and political underpinning was a return to some of Henri Lefebvre's mid-20th century work on the complete urbanization of society in Western Europe. That in turn connects to my second point, namely that the stated orientation of the Asian Urbanisms Cluster from the outset was not merely or even primarily to follow theoretical trends from the Western heartlands of urban studies knowledge production. Rather, the intention has been to build from developments, priorities, and possibilities in Asia, to take Asia seriously, not merely in terms of local or regional empirical findings, but also in generating ideas, approaches, and concepts that can have extra local, more than regional purchase. And then following on again, my third and final set of points has to do with the diversity implied by urbanisms, plural, in the naming of the cluster. There's a danger that the impulse to contest the Euro-American centeredness of urban knowledge production in and from Asia can result in generalized notions of the Asian alternative, when there is, I would say, no one Asian approach, perspective, or reality. The plural urbanisms then does important work in signaling diverse empirical realities, political contexts, schools of thought, rather than a singular Asia. So anyway, I know Asian urbanisms remains awkward as a title. Some have explicitly grumbled about it. Others just ignore it and revert to the singular when I'm not watching. At least you now all know the reason or motivation behind that nomenclature, even if you still don't like it. There was in fact an urban studies cluster at ARI even before Asian urbanisms. It was termed at that time sustainable cities. Now that was, and probably remains, an excellent frame for an urban studies cluster. But establishment of the Center for Sustainable Asian Cities in the School of Design and Environment at NUS compelled ARI to change focus and to emphasize other aspects of urbanization in the region. As some of you know, Mike Douglas took over as leader of Asian urbanisms in 2012. I'm delighted to see Mike's face on the screen here. I've not seen him for ages. Welcome, Mike. Mike was followed by Ho Kong Chong. I can't see on the screen, but might be here as well. I hope he is, in which case, hi, KC as well. And then back to me earlier this year. We each, of course, have had our own emphases and preferences, guided in part by wider shifts institutionally and in terms of the funding landscape, as well as intellectually. I could talk a lot more about that, but I made a conscious decision in anniversary year not to trace Asian urbanisms through its successive cluster leaders. Instead, I wanted to use this as an opportunity to engage or re-engage with selected scholars who have come through ARI as part of their ongoing wider career as urbanists. Ultimately, and it was very difficult, but I selected 3 of them, and I'm delighted to say that all 3 of those accepted. I'll start to introduce them now. So they are first, and by the way, I'm going to go into in chronological order here of when our distinguished speakers were first associated with ARI. So that means first, Lee Min Hee, who was a leading player in urban research at ARI before it became Asian urbanisms. An architect by training, Lee Min also played an important foundational role in the Center for Sustainable Asian Cities in NUS's School of Design and Environment. Lee Min is currently Director of Research at the Center for Livable Cities, CLC, here in Singapore. So welcome, Lee Min. I won't read out your full biographical details, nor for the other panelists either. Anybody who's interested, of course, can look at the email flyer that was circulated for those details. Our second panelist today is 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧, who first joined ARI about a decade ago, having completed her PhD in city and regional planning at Columbia University. 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧 is now professor at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi, Pakistan, and director of the Karachi Urban Lab. So great to see you again, 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧 as well. And third, and finally, Eli Elenoff was a postdoctoral fellow in both ARI's Asian Urbanisms cluster and in the Global Urban Studies cluster in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at NUS before taking up a faculty position in anthropology at the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Eli is now senior lecturer in cultural anthropology at Victoria University. And it's a pleasure to have you back virtually, at least, Eli, too. Okay, so between them, Lee-Min, Nosheen, and Eli's experiences encompass a wide range of urban questions. They extend across a variety of geographical parts of Asia, urban Asia, and they include differing degrees of engagement with worlds of policy and praxis. The way things are meant to work from here is divided into two main parts. In the first part, all three panelists will each get to say a little bit about their own work at ARI. They can remember that far back in some cases, and how it relates to their current research interests, as well as about how they each see the most compelling areas for humanities and social science research on urban Asia at present and into the foreseeable future. So that's the first part. And then the second main part is devoted entirely to discussion, including especially around questions from members of the audience. Now onto the presentation component, sticking for now at least to the order in which I introduced our panelists. And so I invite Lee-Min, first of all, to summarize briefly, just to remind everyone, what research were you conducting at ARI, and how does that inform or contrast with your pursuits as an urbanist now? So Lee-Min, first of all, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks to ARI for having me back. It's been quite a while since I was jointly appointed at ARI, while at the same time being an assistant professor at the School of Design and Environment in NUS. So I recall that while at ARI, I worked on being the co-editor of a book called Future Urban Space, projecting the urban space of New East Asia, which was a book that included many contributions on how the rapid technological, economic, social, and cultural changes were transforming Asian cities. And the book and authors discuss the trajectories and design and planning of Asian cities towards a sustainable future. But I also recall that at the time, I struggled with every word in the title, Future, Asian, and Space. And I never thought that it was kind of very much resolved, and I'm not going to go into any discussion of that here in the midst of so many Asian scholars, but if you pick up the book from NUS Press, do let me have your criticisms of how we tried to define this in looking at this book, because I think every of these words are quite problematic now that I look back at it. And on how my work at ARI had been relevant to what I'm doing now. Currently, I'm the Director of Research at the Center for Livable Cities, which is basically a center for research on cities. And this comes under the Singapore government. So essentially, a lot of the work we look at is on how research could translate to policies within government and have impact, and how we work with the larger research community towards this end. And some of the topics or research programs that we are looking at under the Centers for Livable Cities include these three themes that I will briefly describe. So the first is about cities for people, which aims to translate the needs of the, like how the study of cities translate actually to the individual and to the community, what impacts it has on the individual and on the community, because it's easy to be engrossed in cities research without thinking of the impact on people. And so many of the solutions that we work with the community, the research community, include topics like inclusive cities, healthy cities, as well as looking at how cities could be more car light and to be planned better to cater to the needs of our aging population and to plan for cities that would be resilient to future trends. And that brings me to the second theme of research that we are focusing on. This one is on urban resilience. So urban resilience is again a quite broad term that would include how we build resilient communities, how we build resiliencies to climate change, food, as well as to resource scarcity, which Singapore is acutely exposed to. And then the third track of our work is surprise, surprise, on the future of cities. So again, it's something related to some of the earlier work I've been doing. And this really touches not just on divining what the future means, but really how we apply the sciences such as complexity science, social science, data science on the study of cities, and how we measure the performance of cities by using the correct indicators and urban metrics in order to understand livability and sustainability better. So I think it's really looking for evidence-based research to support the various thematic areas of research we are doing at the CLC to be able to apply some elements of quantification to the very qualitative work that we also do. So that's kind of a short introduction to the work that I've been doing and how, in a way, that has some connection to the work we've been doing in ARI early on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Limin. Roisin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. So first of all, thank you to the Asia Research Institute for inviting me to be a part of this event. And it's good to see Eli and good to meet Limin as well. And so when I was at ARI, which was about a decade ago, I was working on a couple of different projects. One was actually trying to finalize a manuscript for my book that was eventually published in 2015. And the book was the outcome of my dissertation, which was essentially looking at infrastructures of industrial production in Punjab in Pakistan and related practices of repair and upgrading at the sort of level of the firm. And in the context of broader challenges of energy crises that have crippled Pakistan's economy over the last 20 or 30 years. And relatedly, I was involved also in another infrastructure-related project that had been funded at that point in time by the Canadian government, the International Development Research Centre. And this was also Pakistan-focused, but it was focused primarily towards Punjab and the province of Sindh, focusing on the city of Karachi. So when I was looking at the intersections between different types of infrastructures, specifically water, and its sort of accessibility issues in relation to gender, and how these dynamics also pivoted on issues of violence. And because of the specific kind of political economic context that drives water supply and accessibility in cities like Karachi, certain dynamics that are akin to many other cities in the global south, but also that are specific to Karachi. So within these contexts, it seems that infrastructure has become sort of the major theme on which I hang, sort of in which I anchor quite a lot of my research subsequent to my departure from ARI and ongoing work now, which is part of a collective called the Karachi Urban Lab that I sort of patched together, and that's literally what it is. It's more of an experiment in which like-minded people who are academics in Pakistan and also practitioners and representatives of civil society and quite a lot of aspiring undergraduate and graduate students, we've come together to put this together, to think about sort of what are the major themes that we want to work on today, and to create a space within KUL that is through which knowledge can also be made accessible at multiple scales. So in this context, one of the ways in which we do this is, of course, we're funded by international grants because the government of Pakistan doesn't have the money to provide the kinds of resources that enable entities like labs, research labs to survive. And in this broader context, there isn't much of a research culture in any case in Pakistan. So we consider ourselves to be quite privileged in the sense that we've been able to partner with colleagues across the global South and across the global North to situate ourselves amid really critical conversations that also become a pathway to leverage funds that sustain us. And one of the very important means of sustaining us is also paying salaries to young researchers who become a part of these conversations that also enable themselves to flourish, right, and to grow and to leverage the KUL platform to then get into graduate studies or in the policy making forum or whatever. So so mentoring and finding these pathways is a very important aspect of KUL. So infrastructure is a very important theme at the Karachi Urban Lab, and thinking about infrastructures not only in terms of the physical aspects of infrastructures, but also in a very Abdul Malik Simon sense, people as infrastructures as well, right? So quite a lot of my work now, as it relates to infrastructure, is now going down the climate change route. And I've seen this happen quite somewhat unconsciously, sort of semi-consciously in the last 5 or 6 years. And this is also, I think, largely because Pakistan in the broader Asian context is one of those countries which is considered a climate hotspot. And Karachi in the broader context of the province of Sindh is a city that has, it's sort of, you're seeing a multitude of different kinds of climate risks and climate impacts, from droughts to heat to urban heat island effects to urban flooding that are intersecting with long-standing structural dynamics of inequality, anti-poor planning, and so forth. So KUL has become, or is becoming, I think it's always in the process of becoming, an anchor for sustaining conversations, for churning out data. A very important aspect of our objective at KUL is to provide evidence-based, grounded data, something that again is very much lacking in the Pakistan context when it comes to cities or thinking about the urban. And to make this so generative that it also becomes a way to bridge conversations between civil servants, bureaucrats, and policymakers. Huge, huge, huge challenge, massive challenge, not only in the context of Karachi, but more broadly in Pakistan, where cities, interestingly, I mean, we're looking at very high rates of urbanization across Pakistan, but somehow the issue of cities hasn't quite made it into national conversations and national agendas about climate crisis related issues. So these are some of the things that we're trying to push forward, and by bringing in different stakeholders into conversation through outputs, and also trying to innovate with methodologies. This is also a huge challenge for us, whether it's GIS or other forms, other kinds of methodologies, sort of trying to locate ourselves in terms of really reaching out to different kinds of stakeholders. So yeah, so I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nausheen. Thank you. Eli, you're third up. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just go last and thank you, Tim, and the crew at ARI again for putting this together and inviting me and including me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be back among friends, and I can see a lot of you out there today, so that's really nice to see. I was at RE, I arrived at RE late in 2013 on the heels of finishing my dissertation. And so like everyone else, in a sense, what I was trying to do was establish myself as a scholar and to turn that dissertation into a book. So my first main project while I was there was to think through a lot of the kinds of assumptions and conclusions I put together in my dissertation and try to transform that work, which was set in the northeastern Thai city of Khon Kaen, into a kind of a wider context. And in that, RE and NUS were really wonderful places that allowed my thinking to mature and to connect with a huge range of growing conversations, certainly within the Asian urbanism cluster, as Mike Douglas was running it at the time, just created a huge range of different conversations for me to plug into. And also coinciding with Tim, your Urban Aspirations grant, really allowed that project to really grow in a bunch of new ways, expanding aspects of the debates around citizenship and politics that I had already been interested in northeastern Thailand, but locating them more closely in the kinds of aspirations and visions of the good life that the citizens in the city of Khon Kaen that I was working with were developing in and through the materiality of their homes. So in the last year, that project became this book, which I'm extremely pleased to hold up and shill here in front of 100 people. This is Citizen Designs, City Making and Democracy in Northeastern Thailand, which just came out with the University of Hawaii Press last year. And that really explores and expands upon the kinds of ideas around citizenship and political belonging, political struggle that I was exploring throughout my dissertation. But while I was in Singapore, I was also lucky enough to plug in with a second set of projects that were going on there when I already arrived. And those were the ones helmed by Mike, 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧, and Michelle Miller, working on disaster governance in Asia. I had already started shifting towards thinking about climate change and in specific thinking about the ways in which urban materiality both were driving and responding to the climate crisis. So working alongside Tyson Vaughn, who's now a fellow who's now a sociologist with the Army Corps of Engineers, the two of us set out an agenda that we called the Quotidian Anthropocene, which sought to understand the ways in which environmental disaster was already happening, that planetary transformation was already underway, and that cities, and specifically Asian cities and actors across the region, were really responding to those events at an everyday level. That climate change, that planetary transformation was already built into the kind of ongoing sets of practices, politics, ways of knowing that had embedded themselves in Asian cities. So that project also took ages to come together, but I'm also happy to shill this book, the aptly titled Disastrous Times, which came out of the Disaster Governance Grant with University of Pennsylvania Press. And that takes up that kind of everyday look at what it means to live in a moment of planetary transformation. And extends that theoretical framing of the Quotidian Anthropocene to think through a whole range of sites and issues around air pollution, flood, all kinds of things. It's a kind of a wide net. And then the final project that I got involved in while I was there was a collaboration with Malini Sur, who's now at University of Western Sydney, Casey Ho, and Brenda Yo around urban construction and mass construction. One of the kind of really remarkable things about my time in Singapore and really in the region was that across that period, there was just this incredible construction boom. And one of the things that was really evident from that was that the construction industry and practice of construction labor were having radical effects both on the urban environment and on these urban economies. And so we put together a conference at RE, and then out of that grew this special issue of City, which takes on the construction boom and tries to insert conversations around construction sites, practices, economies, and materiality into wider conversations of urbanism. These all, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm a bit like a mole. Once I found my way into a hole, I just kept digging. So I continue to work on a lot of these questions. I'm continuing on a second project on the political ecology and history of concrete in Thailand and really now across Southeast Asia. In 2017, that project was awarded a Marsden Fast Start grant from the Royal Society of New Zealand. And I spent most of 2019 and 2020, or the early part of 2020 until the pandemic really got up to speed in Thailand, conducting fieldwork on that project, kind of chasing down concrete from engineering labs at Chulalongkorn University out to quarries in Saraburi, even further afield out into Pa'an, Myanmar, and following the kinds of long tail effects of the built environment down to Bangkok's coastline, looking at questions around erosion, coastal transformation, and also air pollution. So thinking in a really diverse, multi-sided, and kind of really multimedia way, following the concrete wherever it sort of took me. So those are the kind of main ways in which I'm actually still very much at work on the things I started at RE. So the experience there gave me just a grounds to really start digging in, and I've kept going since.
All right, thank you, Eli, as well. So thanks all three of you. So we all have a kind of sense of where you're up to, which is fantastic. There's so many interesting things going on in all your ongoing careers as urbanists. This is where we turn now to your thoughts, to start to tap your thoughts about ways forward for urban research. Of course, the starting point can be what you're working on yourselves, but this is of course partly about this wider conversation at this moment in ARI's institutional history after 20 years, thinking about what next or where next for urban research. So the question we pose to you, partly for the benefit of everybody else, what do you see as the most compelling areas for humanities and social science research on Asia at present and in the foreseeable future? I think to mix things up a bit, I'm going to ask Eli to go first. We'll do it back in reverse order. So we'll work backwards towards Lee Min again, if that's okay. So Eli, and I'll maybe send you a chat message after 5 minutes, just to tell you when you've had 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be succinct, but it's kind of a big question, so just let me know when I've run over time. It's an interesting and, in fact, I think tricky question to answer where the direction of urban studies goes at the present moment. And I find myself oftentimes being reminded of the Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci's quote that the old world is dying and as the new struggles to be born. And in Slavoj Žižek's phrasing of it, he says, now is the time of monsters. So in that sense, referring to the kind of interregnum, the period of legal and political in-betweenness that follows the death of a sovereign, I think we can think alongside that phrasing, the interregnum, to really situate ourselves betwixt and between moments. And in that, I think there's a bit of danger, morbidity in Gramsci's original text, or monsters in Žižek's rendering, where the specter of possibility and grim disaster infuse nearly every facet of contemporary urban studies. So for me, I think it's that uncertainty of the in-betweenness, the interregnum, that shapes what I think comes next. And in that way, again, I pick up the same themes that I've really centered my investigations on. So the first is the question of the political. This, of course, is a global question, as I think the neoliberal order, or what we had come to call the neoliberal order, which looks very different depending on where you're looking at it from, sort of dissolves or chips away and becomes something else, maybe not better than what it was. We see this in the US, the UK, and elsewhere, along with the rise of populisms, nationalisms, neo-fascisms, neo-militarisms. And indeed, as the democratic telos seems to have collapsed in the US, that country's capacity to enforce, encourage, and reward democratic behavior elsewhere has also dissolved. So we see emergent military formations, authoritarian formations, nationalist formations in a wide variety of spaces across Asia. So while the US's capacity to enforce human rights or democratic norms was always partial and in fact, rarely democratic or consistent, it's worth noting that its disillusion as a center of gravity is meaningful as Asia, and especially as Southeast Asia, continues to forge its own political futures. So this extends a lot of the themes I picked up in my book on citizenship, urbanization, and democracy in Thailand. There, as elsewhere in the region, there's a kind of stunted and complicated transformation at work. When months after I arrived at ARI, a military regime came in and erased another 3 years of democratic governance in Thailand. And that military regime has been in power ever since. And yet across the last year in the wake of the pandemic, we see hugely charismatic and complex uprisings taking place there among the young, being led oftentimes by LGBTQI leaders, young women who are taking profound risks in the name of preserving and extending and returning to democracy. We see these echoed again and again in Indonesia, Myanmar, Hong Kong, similar situations, all where political challenges take place across the stage of the city and are not merely taking place on the city, but oftentimes have to do with the city itself, reformatting it, reshaping it, asserting new sorts of actors, demanding different rights over the urban commons. So all of this kind of political interregnum, I think, stands out as one key domain of investigation. The second scene, I think, of investigation for the future of urban studies here reflects transformations in the kind of post-COVID political economies of construction, real estate, and speculation. This picks up again on my ongoing interest in cement and construction-related industries and the unfolding saga of Evergrande, the Chinese real estate conglomerate that's in the process of collapsing, suggests that something very important is happening in the drivers of urban change that have shaped the built environment in Asia for the last 20 or so years, really alongside the emergence of ARI's Urbanisms cluster. So if, as David Harvey notes, the built environment has become the central focal point of economic investment after the great financial collapse of 2007, largely driven by Chinese investment, then these transformations, I think, speak to something wider, deeper, and much more significant. In Bangkok, when I was working there in 2020, 2019 even, there were lots of echoes of 1996. There were lots of people talking about mass vacancies in apartments, mass vacancies in commercial real estate. And I think the pandemic has only extended that. So these double transformations, I think, force us to ask, what are the macro drivers of urban change and how will they really transform urban space in ways that actually our old models, which were pegged on unlimited urban growth or seemingly massive and expansive urban growth, may not accommodate. So the final bit that I'll point to relates to climate. And the most, as everyone knows now, the most recent IPCC report was a dire one, indicating that our environmental reality has now overshot even the most conservative estimates of our climate forecast. And it consistently seems to do that. We consistently seem to call the climate change more conservatively than it actually is taking place. So in short, our climate futures are becoming more and more present every day. Indeed, from the perspective of Asia, these insights have been readily apparent for a long time. As I said, Tyson and my project on the quotidian Anthropocene was based on that very premise. So I think that those questions continue. That, as Tyson and I put it in our book, that Asia is precisely where we should be looking, not only for stories of disaster, but also for scenes of political, technical, ethical, and social engagements with the everyday realities unfolding as life radically changes on our planet, and rapidly so. As we see, Asia is home to complex and unfolding regional webs of expertise, politics, and knowledge. And this is really, I think, a hallmark of ARI's investigations into Asian urbanisms, is to center the region as a kind of producer and space of its own realities. And yet, at the same time, as Amitav Ghosh has noted, it's also often excluded from these climate change discussions. So I think one of the key spaces in continued investigation is to continue to seek to understand the way in which the work going on within the region is actively producing its own climate futures from the inside. And here, investigating the kinds of debates around urban space are emerging around sea level rise, or the novel forms of disaster governance, as people at ARI have been doing for a long time, continues to be, I think, a source of interest and inspiration. And then the last thing I'll say just very briefly is that all of these things are happening simultaneously. That to demarcate them as different or distinct is to not understand the ways in which political transformation is responding to and reacting to the underwriting economic transformation shaping the city. Or to think simply about climate change is not only to think about climate change, but also to the webs of economic production that are generating and driving our climate crisis. So I think bringing these things together in unique and careful analyses, I think, remains a key challenge for urbanists working in the region.
Thank you, Eli. Nosheen?
Yes, thank you, Tim. That was amazing, Eli. A hard act to follow. So, so let me try and sort of answer that second part of the question on the second round in terms of 3 points, important points that dominate my thoughts. So the first point is a fairly pragmatic one, and this is coming from my own experiences as a researcher, as an academic, and an urban planner. So I think that increasingly, quite a bit of our research in the urban Asian context is going to have to be interdisciplinary as we go along, thinking about the present and the future. And this, of course, dovetails with Eli's very important point about how climate change related vulnerabilities and risks, there are sort of, the multiple simultaneous aspects of all of this also make it very hard for us as social scientists to parse out, where does one thing begin and the other one stop? Where are the boundaries? Sort of how do we parse out these these problems and think about them? Because increasingly, it's increasingly hard for me. So, for instance, I'm involved in a current project these days, actually, with colleagues over at National University Singapore and NTU, which is looking at heat. And interestingly, I've learned in the last year and a half that as a social scientist, I don't know anything about heat. And so I'm actually looking to epidemiologists, working with epidemiologists now quite seriously, and with engineers to start thinking about, well, and environmental scientists to think both qualitatively and quantitatively about the impacts of urban heat islands and global warming on cities, but coming really all the way down to the molecular level, right? This issue of the body itself, which is so incredibly important. And a body that is also gendered, essentially, right? So is there some kind of an epidemiological basis for experiencing heat or the impacts of heat, which are also, related to the gendered body? And so these are some of the issues that at a very pragmatic level concern me today, right? It's the kind of things that keep me awake at night, right? That the more I know, the less I know. So I have to reach out to colleagues from vastly different fields, from the medical sciences and engineering and physical sciences, people that I never thought or imagined I would ever work with, and this is where I'm at today. So the second point that I'd like to make, and this is coming out of Eli's excellent summary, is about uncertainty, right? And because risk and uncertainty are two very different kinds of things, right? So risk is something in the context of climate change. Risk is something, and of course, deeper history is coming out of Frank Knight's work. And so risk is something that we know, that we can seek to mitigate, that we can learn to play with. But uncertainty today is the monster, as climate scientists also know, right? And uncertainty, even though it can be modeled, and there's lots of modeling happening at sort of the global level in terms of what climate scientists are doing, but at a local level, on the ground, that modeling about risk and uncertainty often has very little to do with the perceptions of risks and uncertainties in the lives of the ordinary citizen. And again, there is a gendered component to this, which I feel is very, very important. Men's and women's perceptions about uncertainties and risks vary considerably when it comes to the compounded effects of climate change related impacts and ongoing structural dynamics, long-standing histories of equality and poverty, et cetera, so forth. So how do we think about uncertainty? And I often think about the Australian epidemiologist and sort of the very early proponent of planetary health, 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧, who wrote 25 years ago, in his classic treatise about the impact of a warming world on human health. And he had said that scientists and policymakers are going to have to live with more uncertainty. But what does this actually mean in the lives of ordinary citizens, in an everyday context, right? So that's my second point, and it's a point that that troubles me greatly. It's something that I'm trying to get into deeper in terms of my own research. What does uncertainty mean, both in the present and the future context of the city? And I think that lastly, can we think about radicalizing the notion of uncertainty, right? Is there such a thing as a radical uncertainty? And this is coming a little bit from feminist ecology. And so there was in 2017, this very interesting initiative that was launched in Barcelona called Fearless Cities. And this was about municipal projects from an ecofeminist, anti-capitalist perspective. Of course, sitting in Karachi in Pakistan, these kinds of things are something that you dream about. And, because the context, the political economic context and the stakes are very, very different, right? And we're talking about systemic crises of patriarchy and misogyny and, women in public space and intense amount of violence. We see that in India, but now increasingly in Pakistan also. So, where do you insert this radical feminist ecology about radicalizing uncertainty and thinking about these futures, from a feminist ecological sense? And again, it also comes down to the body, right? It's about women's phatic labor, thinking again about, 𝗔𝗕𝗦𝗧𝗥𝗔𝗖𝗧's work and so forth. So I will stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nosheen. Just as I was about to tell you you had your 5 minutes. Great, thank you. Li-Min, back to you for your second round of presentation.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks to Eli and Nosheen for sharing your valuable thoughts about where research is going. And I thought some of these keywords that you guys mentioned helps me to to form a segue to where I would like to talk about in terms of what I feel that what are the kind of research that would be necessary for cities. So terms like interdisciplinary, risk, and uncertainty are indeed words that very much describe the approaches to research. And I felt that one of the most compelling areas of research and at the Center of Liberal Cities, it's one of the areas we are going very much into. It's actually what we call the science of cities, which is a broad term that includes the application of complexity science, in addition to social science, to the urban context. And we all know that Asian cities are fast developing with rapid technological, economic, social, and cultural changes, bringing about greater heterogeneity, growth, and networks in urban spaces. At the same time, Asian cities are also confronted by challenges that are often manifold, and these are not limited to changing demographics, aging population, and evolving needs. With the advent of the rising middle class, technology, and social media, society will inadvertently become more heterogeneous and polarized. When faced with multiple concurrent challenges to the social fabric, we need greater responsiveness in planning and designing our built environment to strengthen the sense of community. Changing economic structures in an interdependent global network economy. This is where disruptive technologies are changing the way economic activities are organized. the resulting complex networks and linkages between economic activities and decision-making are phenomena that cities need to account for in its future regenerative and circular economy. Resilience towards climate change and managing scarce resources sustainably, balancing ecosystem services supply and demand under climate change is increasingly challenging, and we need to better understand how natural systems interact with other urban systems such as transport, housing, recreational spaces, in making our cities more resilient to these challenges. And of course, not mentioned earlier, but for us, a really big topic would be planning and managing the post-COVID-19 city. The unprecedented pandemic has put to test cities' resilience and robustness, and our ability to maintain the city's function and for it to bounce back better from disruptions. This presents an opportunity for planners to rethink how we work, live, play, and how these patterns might change in the future, whether there's a need to create more self-sufficient districts and towns, and how land use can be planned to be more adaptive to changing needs. Moving forward, we need to view cities not simply as economic powerhouses, but as a system of systems made up of interconnected flows and networks. Digital technologies have enabled the communication, gathering, and analysis of big data that is granular yet with wide in spatial and temporal coverage. This has had huge impacts on urban living and urban networks and can be analyzed across systems and scales and compared over time and visualized to better understand city evolution and adaptation on a finer scale. Big data coupled with high performance computing, analytic tools to process unstructured data, and the rise of artificial intelligence also allows for analysis of a greater variety of data sets in novel combinations to discover new patterns and trends that better reflect reality while simulating increasingly accurate predictive outcomes. So we will need to harness complexity science for a more cross-system, cross-scale, and more evidence-based planning approach for the future of cities. It highlights the importance of time scale to city development, as simple problems of present day could become complex problems if not managed in time or when social, economic, environmental factors evolve over time. I think that's quite a handful, so I'll just stop here and hope that we can have a discussion on this later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Li-Min, and thanks again to all three of you. You've covered a heck of a lot of ground there. Beyond our three speakers, I'm really, really delighted to have seen so many present and also past cluster members and associates that have joined today's roundtable. ARI20 was partly meant to provide opportunities to renew existing personal and institutional connections. It was also meant, of course, as an important chance to build new connections. So it's equally lovely, I think, to have had the chance to see and to hear from people who haven't been part of Asian urbanisms in the past, but maybe some of you hopefully will be during ARI's third decade. So thank you very much, everyone who participated in whatever way, and good evening from Singapore. Thank you.